Okay, welcome everyone to the Asheville City Council's afternoon work session. And this is January 13th, and that means it is Miss Wesley's second day on the job as our new city manager, and this is our first meeting with the city council, so welcome to you. All right, so as this is a work session, I am gonna turn it over to the city manager and get this party started here.
All right, thank you, Mayor. We'll go ahead and get started. Our first presentation is going to be from our Parks and Recreation Director, Mr. McGirt.
All right. Well, good afternoon, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council. The purpose of this presentation today is to talk a little about recovery and what we're hearing in phase one of our infrastructure recovery project, specifically related to the parks projects. I want you to keep in mind as I go through the presentation that we're talking about phase one of public engagement. It includes several components that we'll dive a little deeper into here in a minute. Again, for the record, my name is D. Tyrell McGirt, Parks and Recreation Director, as well as Infrastructure Recovery Board Staff Lead. Our objective today is twofold. One, you're going to hear a little more about the public engagement sessions, specifically feedback that we've heard from the Infrastructure Recovery Board. Went through an exercise in their meeting yesterday where they heard the summary reports of everything, all the public engagement events, and they kind of ranked their top 3 priorities from each of the key themes that rose to the top based on what we heard from the public. And then second vote is to discuss, hear from you all, council, on your top 3 things. What are some of the things that stand out to you with both projects, the Azalea Parks and Infrastructure, as well as the French Broad Riverfront Parks projects. Keep in mind as we have the discussion, though, that we know that there are a lot of asks. There's a lot that the community wants to see. We anticipate time and funding may be limiting factors. So as we talk about what has risen to the top and what the Infrastructure Recovery Board identified as top themes, just because those are the things that have been identified and recognized doesn't mean that we won't try to get to everything, all those themes that we've heard back from the community. For informational purpose, this is kind of what next steps look like, what's next on the agenda for both the Infrastructure Recovery Board to consider, as well as some things that are going to be coming back to you as council to consider related to these projects. We're here today to discuss what phase one of engagement looks like, as well as those top 3 themes that the Infrastructure Recovery Board has identified. In February, we're here, or the Infrastructure Recovery Board will hear more about the funding opportunities and consider some pros and cons with each of the funding opportunities and try to come up with a strategy for the infrastructure projects. We're talking about parks today, but we know we have other infrastructure projects, namely water. We'll have that same conversation with you all again at the end of February. In March, the Infrastructure Recovery Board will review the designs that come back from the consultants for each of the recovery park projects. In March, we'll also come back to council, have that same conversation. And then in May, we'll be ready to look at how all of that comes together in one cohesive unit, and then present that to the Infrastructure Recovery Board. So we know the parks along the riverfronts were devastated. We know it's going to take several years to build back, but now we have a unique opportunity to do something more enhanced, better, smarter, more resilient in these park spaces. So that's what this opportunity includes. This map is just one that has been circulating around. It includes both projects, all the parks that are identified in each of the projects and the infrastructures that we plan to tackle. Keep in mind, however, that we are a couple things. One, committed to the long-term recovery of these projects. So we know this isn't something that's gonna just happen overnight. There's a lot of anticipated need around when can we get back into these park spaces. And our message over and over again is we're committed to long-term recovery. Having said that, we know that once we understand what we're gonna be building back, that the goal is to have a phased approach to bringing back some of these spaces sooner rather than later. So we're not waiting to the end before we get everything reopened. And then three, we just have zero interest in just building back what was there before. So this is a unique opportunity. We've gone through devastating times, but we want to take advantage of this time, again, to build back better, smarter, more resilient. So phase one of the public engagement process included several components. We had a community open house on December 10th over at Asheville Middle School, where we saw over 200 community residents and business members come out and provide their feedback on what they're seeing and hearing and what they would like to see in these park projects. For those who were unable to make the December 10th community open house, we had an open survey that was available to the public from November 24th through December 19th. So citizens were able to see a lot of the same renderings or ideas that was at the community open house and provide their feedback via the online survey. We had several pop-up events. These pop-up events took place in parks, along greenways, and our public housing units, us going directly to the people and trying to meet them where they are and also solicit additional feedback on what they would like to see built back in these spaces. And then lastly, we had designated focus group discussions with key stakeholder groups and residents from the community, namely in the areas of recreation, business, neighbors, and environment, to hear directly from them regarding their specific interests in building back these park projects. Survey participants, good turnout. We had over 2,300. From that 2,300, we asked in the survey that residents self-identify if they choose to. They didn't have to, and not everyone chose to. But of the ones that did, we had 43% of the respondents choose to fill out the demographic information. Now, what that looks like is we know that there are some disparities and some opportunities moving forward for us to capture or do a better job of hearing back from our BIPOC communities, as well as participants in lower incomes, renters, and young adults. As we look at the survey results, it's important to also keep in mind that we had a number of special interest groups that showed up in force at the community open house that got themselves organized, got the word out to fill out the community survey. So as we're looking through the results, we know that this is also a factor that we have to keep in mind and capture when we're thinking about the recommendations that have come out of it. Moving forward, again, this is just phase one of the public engagement process. The goal is we know that this is an issue, identify additional opportunities for us to better capture, get a higher percentage of community responses that we're not hearing from now.
So from a practical reason, from a practical standpoint, are we saying the survey is not reliable?
No,
Is that?
we're not saying that. Again, it's just one piece.
Okay, so we're saying that the majority of people did not choose to give a demographic response.
Correct.
And then we know that there were special interest groups in attendance. So are we to
Correct.
assume that the survey perhaps is skewed?
I think that's a fair assessment.
And so if it is perhaps skewed, does that mean the survey is then not reliable?
It's just one piece of the public engagement process in phase
Okay.
one.
Thanks.
Yep.
I have a follow-up question, if I might. Given that renters were also in the list and folks with lower incomes, I really appreciate that you're making an intention to go to where people live and work, like the farmer's market and the parks and going into neighborhoods. I know we've worked a lot on engagement over the years. Do we reach out to the tenants network or organizations that advocate for renters to see if they'll share our surveys?
I don't know if we had that specific, reach out.
I'm happy to make a connection if that's helpful, just because it's pretty rare to see that here, but it's not uncommon that it shows up in our data.
That's true, and just for council to know, Dowa Hedge, Communication and Public Engagement Director, in our managed lists, within our citizen relations module, we do have opportunity for people to self-identify as renters, and then we have reached out to renters who have networks. So when we send out those invitations, they get it in their inbox and encourage them to pass it out. So we do have a pathway, and we do always, often see that they might be underrepresented, and then we just walk through our regular practice of, once we see that, through our digital information, making sure we're getting out on the ground and using our relationship connections to help amplify that.
Thank you. You're
When you talk about interest groups, I mean, I haven't gone to this particular meeting, which was so well attended. The boards that were displayed and that people could give feedback in, and like the table you see there where people can give their feedback, it didn't feel like there were like, I mean, choices and what you were asking people to weigh in on didn't seem like really polar opposite concepts necessarily. It was just kind of more around preferences. So when you say a special interest group, do you mean like pickleball answered a lot of the survey results, and so you're being mindful of that, or is that what we're talking about?
Exactly.
So if it's just an example,
Yes.
right? Okay, right. So we know about the pickleball people. Yeah.
Well, we don't want to call out any special.
It just sounds a little more nefarious when you say special interest group, but really it's, people that want more pickleball, which is true, and there are, that's very valid. So I just was trying to make it like, anyway, that was what I experienced.
Yeah. I think another example would be like our skating community. We know that we
Yes.
lost
Yeah, a lot of
the skating
enthusiasm.
rink in Carrier Park. We don't have a duplicate of that in our system. And this is something that community members feel pretty adamant about bringing back. This is a lost recreation amenity, and we're hearing from those groups. So that's an example
Yeah.
of people getting motivated, because in this example, we just don't have that duplicate in our system right now.
Yeah.
I do want to just add that there are a number of community engagement or city plans that already exist, namely Recreate Asheville, Closing the Gap, the action plan for CDBGDR. All of the plans that are currently on the books right now are the same plans that the consultants have been asked to also consider. Each of those plans had considerable public engagement opportunities and feedback from the community members. So while we're missing the desired feedback or more feedback in this particular phase one approach, we do have other plans that the consultants are pulling from that also had considerable public feedback. So the Azalea Parks and Infrastructure Recovery, these are the things. You will notice that these, based on the survey, the community open house, those pop-up events, these are some of the themes that rose to the top that we're hearing from participants. Alternative sports and lifestyle activities, ecological stewardship, flood resilience as a design standard, nature play, nature first trails and connectivity, pedestrian safety and multimodal access, and community pools or swimming pools and water access. When we had this discussion yesterday with the Infrastructure Recovery Board, again, they were asked to identify what are the top themes that you see based on the summary results and what we're hearing from community as those main things that you want to prioritize moving forward. And the Infrastructure Recovery Board identified flood resilience, and I just want to note that although they identified this as their first priority, they saw the importance of flood resilience as a design standard being understood and included across anything that we're doing or planning to build or enhance in this project, being across all the entire scope. So keep that in mind. Pedestrian safety and multimodal access was the number 2 priority. And then there was a tie for the third, being alternative sports and lifestyle activities and nature first trails and connectivity. So from the Infrastructure Recovery Board, those are the top 3 priorities that they identified as important, with some conversation, lots of conversation around each of these and points of clarity. They were also asked to, from their perspective, identify anything that they think is missing from the survey or anything that did not show up. And based on the conversation that we had, climate change was something that stood out to them, specifically naming that out as something that is missing from the survey results, but they also understood that that could be a part or fall up under the umbrella of flood resilience. A lot of conversation around multimodal access, and then the alternative sports and lifestyles, understanding that activities like disc golf, skateboarding, et cetera, were important to them. They named those things, not necessarily missing, but again, specifically just wanted to name some of the activities that they want to emphasize. With the French Broad Riverfront Parks recovery, these are some of the top themes that rose to the top. And as you look over these, I'm just going to name out the top 3 that the Infrastructure Recovery Board identified as their top priorities. The first being multimodal transportation artery. The second, river access for outdoor economy. And then the third identified is reforesting and the riparian health of our riverbanks in this area. You can see there are other themes dedicated: cycling and skating spaces, nature play, active agility, safety and visibility, and third space for social health are some of the other themes that kind of rose to the top from the survey results and phase 1 of the public engagement piece. They were asked again to identify anything that was missing from the survey that they're not seeing. There, again, nothing that they identified specifically was missing, but conversation around connectivity and transportation, that was really important to the group, as well as the environmental resiliency, reforesting, riparian health was something that really stood out to the Infrastructure Recovery Group. So, based on this information, this is an opportunity for council, based on what you're hearing from the summary reports from phase 1 of public engagement and kind of what we're hearing as top priorities from the Infrastructure Recovery Board. This is our opportunity to just kind of hear from you all on what you're hearing, how does this sound? Do you all identify anything that may be missing? This is our opportunity to get feedback from council before we move into the next phase with the consultants.
I have one area of concern that I know that you're aware of, but we might want to just have in the conversation for the public record is the issue of the flood maps. We kind of know where the river was because we're looking at the damage, but we won't have the flood maps for a while. So what is staff using to guide what resilience looks like so we're better prepared for the next flood?
And I'm almost certain that that's included in the consultant's material that they're considering, understanding the challenges, not having that readily available right now, but something that the consultants are aware of.
And then the second thing is when we did the CDBG-DR recovery funding survey, I did hear a lot of community support for taking the time to do it right, not just do it fast. But also, as we're beyond a year since the storm, I know that folks are like, while we take the time to do it right, what does it look like to have some interim infrastructure? For example, commuters that are moving from West Asheville, Biltmore Park, River Arch District and beyond are commuting across the Amboy Bridge. They totally acknowledge that the infrastructure under the bridge was damaged, and they're looking for a safe way to cross Amboy Road, as pedestrians, cyclists, and also for commuters of cars who want to watch out for people that are crossing. So I know that there's a conversation happening right now with DOT, and hopefully the city, to make sure that there's some opportunity for interim infrastructure. How much would it cost? Where's the right spot? But that's just one example. Obviously, we don't want to spend all of our resources on small interim fixes when we need to think about long-term investment. But I just want to make sure that we're hearing both the need to take the time to do it right, and also there's going to be some times we need an interim fix, like the partnership for skating facilities.
Yeah, yep. Noted.
Thank you.
Also a part of the Infrastructure Recovery Board discussion yesterday.
I'll chime in that appreciate all the work of Recovery Board and everybody that's been looking at this. When I look at the themes, I get excited. Like if we can use this huge opportunity of all this federal funding to build this, I just find that really hopeful for our community, especially in the doldrums of winter. I definitely also just want to elevate the reforestation and riparian health. We know that along the French Broad River, one of our healthiest riparian areas, which is basically the side of the river where there's a bunch of trees and shrub, is the Karen Craig Nolan Park. And that was so mildly impacted because the buffer to the river did its job. And so we have so much parkland across these rivers that previously maybe we'd see a 6 or 10 foot buffer with some trees and it wasn't that healthy and it wasn't designed to protect us. That if we could really challenge ourselves to use as much more of that space, I think that it would have such a safety impact for our community and our businesses and our thriving arts district. So I just really want to elevate that in my priorities. And it doesn't surprise me and it excites me that the infrastructure board called that out as well, that's just such a need and such an opportunity and a place that city programs usually don't pay for, right? This is the pot of money. These are the opportunities to really do this right for a city. So I think that's really exciting. And similarly, when we look at Azalea Road, looking at flood resilience and flood storage, so that's upstream, and we've looked at that area for a long time for flood storage. So what does resilience look like for a soccer facility, which is big old flat fields, but it's been destroyed multiple times now. So how can we minimize the impact while maximizing flood storage upstream? Those are two of my top priorities for this public land. Communities usually don't get the opportunity to have this much public land next to a river that poses so much threat and risk. And so I really look forward to us being visionary around those areas.
Noted.
Can I ask so on the pots of money for all this, we've got the FEMA recovery money that will rebuild. I call it the insurance claim money because it's akin to how you might think about an insurance claim. And we're very slowly getting that. That's already been funded. Senator Budd's office called me yesterday they always call when we get another clearance around, and we're getting another $7.5 million for across 3 different projects. One of them's water, one of them's roads and bridges, and I don't recall what the third one is, but it's a slow process, but it's money that we will get. We're just gonna have to keep working to get it in the door. But the rebuild of Azalea and French Broad River Parks will hopefully incorporate HMGP money, hazard mitigation funds, to build back better, more resilient, as you talk about. Those monies are not moving at all yet. they're funded by Congress, but they're not moving. This is a big issue the governor's focused on, because this doesn't just affect us, it also affects individuals who are waiting for buyouts for their homes and elevations for their homes. Do you feel like, in thinking about how quickly these projects can move, do you feel like there's a scenario where HMGP will take however long it takes? I don't want to put a number around that. I'm going to Washington tomorrow to continue to urge those funds to move as quickly as possible. But do you foresee that this rebuilding will be in any way forestalled if HMGP is stalled more than the FEMA recovery dollars and they're out of sync in terms of funding?
We try to, as we plan for these recovery projects, take that into account.
Okay.
Understanding that the PA money, the insurance money, as you say,
Yep.
is the money that gets us what we had there before. So the consultants know that part of their task is to design based on that dollar amount, whatever that comes back to. But also some of the additional enhancements that will include the HMGP as well as the DR funding to design to that scope. So
Okay.
we are aware that timing is a concern, and coordinating HMGP with DR is a challenge. Dustin, who is managing these projects for us, I'm sure is pulling his hair out every time he looks at numbers and timelines, because it can be a challenging thing to do. But we are planning with that in mind.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good, because I would hate for us to get to a point where we're having to say to the community, well, we delayed a PA project because we were hoping to get HMGP and it's just not walked in the door yet. And I don't want us to be in that situation because, obviously, this is our first experience with a major disaster. And I think the community expectation around the timeline to rebuild is an unknown. I mean, we don't know, we've never done this before, they don't know. But what we hear from other communities and what we hear from the federal government is you should anticipate a multi-year rebuilding process. So I think we need to do some work around educating the public as to our timing of these projects, and help provide some expectations around that. Just reading, some of the press coverage around this, there, even our press seems not to understand exactly what to anticipate in terms of the timing of a rebuild coming from this. And then, to make matters even more complicated, we have other buckets of money, right? We have bond money, we have Parks and Rec bond money, and so here we are, we're opening, soon we'll be opening Stevens Lee's new park, for example. And I think for the public, they don't necessarily differentiate when you reopen a park in one park versus another, but in our minds, of course, it's very different because we're able to use different resources for these different projects. So just continuing to try to educate the public around the expectations tied to these different funding sources.
Noted.
I had another question, or a question. I think everybody knows costs are just skyrocketing in our grocery stores as well as in our city budgets, particularly around construction. It's just a runaway train. And so right now, we're doing a lot of planning, or we'll soon be doing design work. Can you just talk through what type of precautionary measures we're doing so that we don't do the due diligence time in a design phase and then have to compromise our aspirations when we get to the construction phase because cost escalation and it just isn't enough? Like, how do we hedge against that? How do we plan for that, especially when we have such a long multi-year design and build process?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that. I asked Jay to step in, but I will share that keep in mind with these projects, we do have the design phase first. So we know that's going to take a while before we can even get to the construction phase of these projects. So, Mayor, speaking to you, the timing that you have concerns around, hopefully the plan that the consultants are working with is, as we go through design, we know that's going to be a time-lengthy process before we can even get to the construction phase of this. And hopefully by then, having some definitive answers on HMGP, PA funding will be a little more clear by that time. I know we have a built-in escalator with any of our projects, because there's a design phase that takes a while, and before we can even get to the construction piece. So when we're putting together the budgets for these capital projects, that escalator is included. What the unknown is just how much. And I don't know, do you have anything else to add to that, Jade?
Good afternoon, Council. Jay Dundas, Assistant City Manager. This is a great answer. The only two things I'd add to that would be that the PA process does have opportunities to consider cost escalations and unexpected costs. It's called versioning. It's essentially you go back and we request additional funds given changing circumstances. We are doing our best, as Dee said, with trying to estimate and expect those costs and through the negotiation process. I'd also say that in the upcoming presentation on financial, we'll hear about the CIP contingency that we're making sure that we'll have enough to cover any unexpected costs. So we're making contingencies to try to, and also using the process to try to head off those unexpected changes.
Great, yeah, especially as we go into budget conversations, just the more aggressive we can be with contingency planning, I think the more prudent.
All right,
Great work, thanks.
thank you.
Thank you, Dee. Up next, we'll have a presentation. We're starting to have conversations around developing our 2027 budget. The team is gonna talk more about this, but just for the record, this is the beginning. Very often you will see changes in these numbers. There's lots of unknowns, things that we don't know now that we're making estimations for, but as we go through the spring, we'll refine that and have more accurate information for council and for the public. Thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Spangler. I am the Budget and Performance Manager for the City of Asheville. All right, so I'm here today to give everyone kind of the beginning of the budget process for our FY27 budget. I think this is a little bit earlier in the process than we normally come to you, but we wanted to start this process now because some of what we're seeing indicates there could be a larger than usual gap between revenues and expenses. So, we wanted to start the process a little bit early and talk through how we got to this place, what are some strategies to close the gap, and what this process is gonna look like for the next several months before June when we have to adopt the budget. And we'll talk a little bit about capital as well. All right, so starting off with some challenges that we're seeing for next year. This year, of course, the year that we're in now, we have a balanced budget, and part of the way that we balanced that budget was taking some one-time actions that we may not be able to take all of these into next year's budget. So, for example, you'll see we took about $5 million in cuts, spending cuts last year. I'll show those on the next slide so everyone can remember what they are. We also utilized some one-time revenue sources. We took out a $5 million FEMA community disaster loan, and we also used some one-time fund balance to close that gap between spending and revenue for this year. So just to jog everyone's memory, here are some of the savings that we took for closing the gap in this year's budget. And some of these we may be able to take again this year. Some we may need to put back in the budget, or might be a discussion with council later on if we want to continue cuts or put some of them back. But we're working on looking at these. All right, so this slide shows the past 10 or so years of unassigned fund balance. So this is, the city's unassigned fund balance that we have. Our policy is to keep 15% of that aside. As you can see, after COVID in FY22, there was a rather large bump, so we got up to that 24% high there. And ever since then, we've been slowly kind of eating into that balance, so much so that the last year that we just ended, FY '25, we actually ended below our 15% target. So all this goes to say that it would be unadvisable to continue to use fund balance to cover our operating expenses going forward. So on the next few slides, we are going to talk through some of these items that are on this slide. Basically, as we start to put together the budget for next year, we're seeing some costs that are increasing next year. These are costs of doing the exact same things that we're currently doing, just the cost of doing business is increasing in some situations. So we'll kind of talk through in detail what some of these are in the next few slides. Right, healthcare and retirement. So these two things go up every year. However, we are anticipating, especially this healthcare costs. We are in a national healthcare cost crisis. These costs are going up exponentially across the entire country. So what we're seeing here is no different. We are expecting we'll have to spend about $5 or $6 million over what we have in this year's budget on healthcare for city employees. And we also have here the retirement costs. So this is more normal. We are mandated to pay a certain amount into the state's retirement system. That amount goes up every year, so we're anticipating to have to spend another $500,000 on that as well. All right, next, the transit contract. So the current transit contract's expiring, and transportation is working tirelessly on executing a new contract to get that in place for next year. It's a little bit early to know exactly what to expect with bids, but right now, at least, we're baking into the budget that we could need an additional $3 million on top of what's budgeted this year to cover the new contract. Security at community centers. So as you all know, this year there were some safety concerns at the city's community centers. So the decision was made to provide security at all of those centers. And because it was an unexpected cost this year, we had to use fund balance to cover that cost. And so to minimize the impact to our fund balance, we just funded what was needed for the remainder of FY '26, meaning that once we get to next year, we'll have to budget a year and a half of the contract. So that's about $1.8 million. APD staffing. So because APD has had some high vacancy rates over the past few years, we have made the decision to leave some positions unbudgeted in recent years. Right now, police has 42 unbudgeted sworn vacancies. So the good news is that they are doing great at hiring. They have a recruitment firm that's really paying off. And so they're getting to the point where we're going to start to need to add budget back to their headcount. So my staff is still analyzing what exactly that looks like. Right now, our just ballpark estimate is about $500,000, but again, we're still looking at numbers for that. Right, and lastly, after the general obligation bonds were approved by the voters in November of 2024, that referendum came with a tax rate increase of 2.58 cents, which is about $6.5 million. So last year during the budget process, we did delay increasing taxes for that due to Helene, and so we have to do that this year. All right, so in the interest of transparency, we did want to add all of those spending increases up. These are, again, just the cost of doing business that we are already doing. A lot of these are uncontrollable expenses that are either happening all over the state or all over the country. And so, I also just want to emphasize as much as possible that this is very early in the process. This number will change. Some of these might fall off. Some other things might get added. But we just want, at this point in the process, to make clear to everyone what are the additional expenses we are looking at for next year as we know them. And again, we'll talk later about the rest of the schedule for the budget process, but as we come to you, every time we come to you, we'll have more information and be able to kind of finesse this number as we go. And before we skip over to revenue, just want to make the point to everyone that that gap that we just discussed doesn't include any new funding considerations that might be discussed as part of the budget process. So it would not include any wage increases for employees, any market or pay plan adjustments that folks might want to consider for public safety. It does not include any new firefighters for the 4th shift that council approved last year, and anything else that might come up as part of the process. All right, so switching over to look at what we're seeing on the revenue side, and again, it's very early. We're still looking at what the ultimate picture is going to show us. But we wanted to talk a little bit about property taxes. So this year, we're going through the reval process, meaning the county is in the process of changing values to everyone's property. In fact, the tax assessor will be at the meeting later tonight to give everyone kind of a process update on that. And so just a little bit, it's a little bit technical, but as part of the budget process, we must, by state law, calculate a revenue neutral tax rate. So that will show what the property tax rate would be if we wanted to achieve the same amount of revenue with the reval. So we don't have the info yet from the county. I believe by the time we come to you next, we may have that information. But once we do get it, we'll be working to calculate that revenue neutral tax rate and what it means along with the county. So given what we're discussing today, we do anticipate that we will need to set the property tax rate at a level that's above the revenue neutral rate. And this is to bridge the gap that we just discussed here. It's to fund the debt for the GO bonds for capital projects. And if there's a decision to restore fund balance to our 15% policy, that would also increase property taxes as well. Just quickly on some other revenue sources that are more minor than the property taxes. It's a little bit early for us to talk about sales tax. We're monitoring it as it comes in, but it does come in on a 3-month lag, so we don't have a ton of data yet for 26. We do expect that we'll be recommending fee increases for services such as water, solid waste, stormwater, and potentially some others as well. My team is evaluating what that might look like. Specifically want to call everyone's attention to the water rate discussion. 3 years ago, council approved a 3-year rate model adjustment, which basically worked to right size the amount that the commercial ratepayers and the homeowners were paying so that they were more equitable. And so this is year 3 of that plan that was approved. Do want to note that because of all the work that's going on in our water system, because of Helene and regular maintenance, there probably likely will be a need to continue to raise water rates after this year, but because there's so much up in the air in terms of what FEMA will cover, we will have to reevaluate that next year once we have more data and information. All right, so talked a lot about what we're seeing on the revenue side at this early stage, but if there's a desire to, as much as possible lessen the burden on property taxpayers, then we will have to consider decreasing our spending as a city. And we just want to be clear up front that because we've worked really hard with all departments to keep their budgets very lean over the past few years, as we've dealt with a few difficult budget processes, there's no low-hanging fruit that we can take that will cover this $30 million gap. So if we do go the route of decreasing spending, that does necessarily mean service reductions. And my team is working with all departments to kind of take a look at what that might mean, be able to bring some options to council to take a look at. All right, just to quickly touch on capital, so there's additional challenges here. I think Jade kind of just brought this up, but we're trying as best as possible to keep FY27 flat to what was approved in last year's 5-year CIP. And as Jade mentioned, we do have some Helene recovery projects that, you know, there's a potential might not get fully reimbursed by FEMA, you know, as we continue negotiations with them over those projects. So we are anticipating that we'll need to kind of build in a little bit of a buffer to fund anything unexpected that comes up in terms of like a gap between what FEMA will give us and what the actual cost of the project is. So again, my team is still in the process of determining what that's going to look like. All right. As I mentioned, this is the very beginning of the process. So this is our first work session. We will have a public comment on February 10th. And I do want to note for the record here that we did change this date. I think it'll be a motion tonight to change this date. It was the last meeting in January, this public comment, but we are proposing to move it to February because the January meeting is at 10 in the morning, and so we wanted to make it more accessible to people by having it at the 5 p.m. Council meeting. So that's why we're requesting that change, just to let everyone know. And then, you know, through the spring, through March and April, we'll come and discuss the budget many more times with you through work sessions, through discussions on fees and charges. And then, of course, in May, we'll come with a proposed budget, the manager's proposed budget. And we'll have a public hearing also in May, leading to budget adoption in June. So looking forward to many more productive conversations. Thank you.
All right. Questions, comments?
I have many of both. It's pretty sobering. Kind of my first question is, you know, this will be my fourth budget, and this is definitely the most stark. It's also what I feel at home. You know, inflation's been really hurting a lot of us. When was the last time the city's budget had such a big projection for a shortfall? I'm trying to understand relatively how bad this is. You know, I worked for the city from 2007 to 2014 during the financial crisis, and I remember very, very hard times. And my guess is it hasn't been this bad since then.
Yes, and might not be as bad.
Well, that'd be great.
I'll say, first of all, as I've mentioned a few times, it's early. So we usually don't come this early. I'll also note that especially this early in the process, it's normal to see a gap. We have never started the budget process saying we fixed it. We're expecting the exact amount of revenue that we need to cover our spending. I will say for context, last year, even a little bit later in the process, we did estimate about a $15 million gap the first time we came to you with a number. So this is obviously, you know, a bigger number, which is why we wanted to come earlier rather than later. But agree, it is a big number, which is why we want to start the process early, discuss options sooner rather than later.
A follow-up to that.
Well, I mean, we don't have here, just to make sure that the communication and education around this to the community is sort of even keeled. We don't have our revenue projections baked in here, and we do normally see an increase in revenues year over year.
Right, and I think what we're gonna see this year is, in terms of revenue, is still up in the air. We're not, you know,
Right,
expecting a
you're
huge
setting the
windfall.
stage of, there is a shortfall that we would not anticipate natural revenue growth to cover, and everybody needs to have that base level understanding. So revenue growth will cover something, but we've got a large number here that we need to contend with. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's very, very useful. As we move forward, it would be helpful to see cost growth projections for peer cities. I think, you know, when we've the last several years seen sales tax decline, for example. It wasn't just us, it was across North Carolina. And, you know, myself and many others have been talking to our peers and seeing similar challenges. My sense is that some of these cost increases are really structural to our budget, also based on the macroeconomy. But it'd be nice as we go through and get more information to have some sense of peer cities in North Carolina and what type of challenges they're facing as well. So that's not for today, but a request.
Yeah, thank you, and I think you're totally right about that. It is hard to differentiate what is because of things that are happening all over the state and all over the country versus, you know, there is a little extra that we have to deal with because of Helene, because our economy is still recovering from that. So it's both, and we can definitely put something together on peer cities across the state.
Yeah, that'll just help. I'll pause. I have other stuff once we get into other questions, but curious to hear from my peers.
Okay.
Or-
Or do you want to, yeah, I mean, I will say, I think we've had some time to sit with this a little bit because we've been gradually getting educated around this. So we're now presenting the same things that we've learned about sort of this last week to the public. So don't take our quietness to mean anything other than we're kind of already have processed this to some extent. This is an opportunity to present this information to the public. And our you know, this is how we like to invite new managers to join us over here at the city. Start out with a big challenge. But if you've got more
Yeah.
questions, comments, please proceed.
You've mentioned a couple different times here how you're coming to us earlier, and I think that's really important. My hope is that as more data rolls in, we see a sharper picture and it's better. So I'm gonna hold that, that hope, and I think that's not uncommon. And I think my reflection from previous years with budgeting is that, you know, sometimes costs just jump up and you have to handle it, and that's the world. But I also think that the way that cities are set up in North Carolina really is to a disadvantage. We really have some, again, I'll say structural designs that make it hard for us to be proactive sometimes. And so I also have observed that we kind of take the budget 1 year at a time, and that's very reasonable because no one has a magic 8-ball to say, in 7 years, our budget will be X, Y, or Z. I get that. But I really would be curious about looking at what a multi-year budgeting framework would look like. We know that we believe in our staff and that healthcare costs are always going up, period. So what does multi-years look at? Not that we'll come up with a magic solution, but sometimes it takes many years to dig into a hard problem or to really fix a structural challenge. And so I'd really love for us to start looking at multi-year strategies for addressing costs as well as revenue. I don't know that I've really been part of a conversation that's more than 1 year at a time. Are we gonna look at fees, rates? But, you know, a big part, I think, of our role is building bridges to Raleigh. Although they don't always build them back towards us. I'm not naive to say that let's just go build some bridges and we're gonna get Raleigh to be on our side. That's never really been the case. But staff are so talented. If y'all really said, what if we could pull this off? It might take 3 years, it might take 5 years. What if we allowed ourselves to think about those bigger strategies, bigger approaches, and chip away at that? And then we step into our roles to figure out how to do all that hard bridge building and alliance making. So those are things that I'm curious about what my peers think about. My experience has been we've done a lot of 1 year at a time approaches, which make a lot of sense. So I want to thread the needle between what's realistic and practical. But I would be really curious just to hear from staff, what are your big ideas that you felt are kind of crazy because they might take too long or they might be too hard? Because I fear that challenges like this are going to be the new norm in city budgets in North Carolina, and so I'd like to be part of those big picture ideas.
If I could add to that, before my time on council, I attended the Budget and Finance Committee meetings, and there was an attempt at a 3 to 5 year sort of snapshot or at least projection, and it was considered terrifying to plan that far in advance because there were so many unknown variables. But it was very grounding, and the conversation was very serious as far as like planning revenue and projections and plotting partnerships and collaboration. And because it was so grounding and serious, it stuck with me. It also stuck with me that I only saw it once. So I would definitely support having a projection, even if it's imperfect, just so that we can look at trends in our costs and revenue.
Yeah, and I'm Tony McDowell, Finance Director. I was just going to add quickly to that point. I think, yeah, definitely the revenue structure in North Carolina is very limiting for local governments. I think it's actually tomorrow, right, the General Assembly is having a session where they're looking at property taxes and looking at reforming the property tax system. We're going to keep our eye on that, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, we don't know which direction that'll ultimately go in, whether it will be something that will be
Looking at the
positive.
press, it does not look favorable for
No, it does
cities.
not
And
look
talking
favorable
to our
for-
lobbyists, I'm nervous.
So that's,
Yeah.
and you know, that being a revenue source that for us is 50% of our general fund budget, and that's true across the state, the general fund, cities rely on that revenue more than anything else. So any reforms to that system that take revenue away from us is gonna make it even more challenging. But yeah, we'll definitely work on a 5-year forecast. We didn't do one last year, but partly because Helene and everything, but we did 2 years ago, right near the end of the budget process. I think you all asked to see similar information. And we did put together a 5-year forecast, and it's very sobering because you almost immediately begin to see gaps between revenues and expenses as you move beyond year one. But yeah, we'll definitely work on that again.
Yeah, and I think, the forecast is I might be nervous asking for that because it might be very sobering. But as much of the request is about forecasting as it is around multi-year strategies, as opposed to this year we can do this to this line item. So for example, earlier Lindsay mentioned we're in the 3rd year of a rate plan for the water system. And that was the first year was very hard to do that. We had to look at, what if we spend this out 3 years, 6 years? We looked at a lot of variations because it was sobering, but we had a hard conversation. We engaged a lot of folks in it, and then we just said, all right, we're doing this, and we're committed, and now we're in year 3. And I think that biting off big, hard things in those tranches is useful. Similarly, earlier this week, no, it must have been last week, we saw how Buncombe County and Asheville City and Buncombe County schools came to an agreement. As folks probably know, the supplement to schools is the biggest chunk of Buncombe County's budget. And they have struggled every year trying to negotiate how to support schools and have a healthy budget as the county, and they came to a 3-year agreement. And so I'm not as familiar with the details of that one, but as much as I'm curious about the projections, as I'm curious about the strategies of what happens if we take a bite towards a big goal multiple times, and what does it take to think that through and come up with those ideas?
Yeah, and as you all know, compensation, personnel costs, compensation and benefits is the biggest part of our budget. And I know Emily, our HR director, is very eager to start talking to you all during the
Yeah.
process this year about some multi-year strategies related to both as well. So we'll definitely incorporate that. So.
I think I have 5 things. Some of them will probably need future follow-up. And some of them are just confirming that I had correct information from our 101s that I was scheduled with staff last week. Number 1 might be for future reference. Do we have an idea from the pool of funds that we set aside the past couple years, how much of the property tax mitigation grants were utilized? Was there remaining funds? Was there more demand than there was funding? Because we know that when we raise property taxes, it hits some of our neighbors harder than others, and it affects all of our community, but especially like residential and commercial renters. So if we're not using the fund, is it a outreach problem? If we need more funds, is that identified?
Yeah, so you're correct, we did pay into that fund last year, and I cannot remember off the top of my head how much we put into it, but I do know that it is, as you say, it's underutilized. And so that could be, do you remember how much we added?
Yeah, I think, great question to ask the tax assessor when he's here tonight, since that is a county-run program. We do have the data. The county sends us a report every year after they close the program out. I don't think they've closed the program out this year. It's usually sometime between January and March that we get the final information. But we can share that with you all, show you all how many folks are utilizing it and what we're paying into the program. So.
But it's, my understanding, it hasn't been exhausted yet in a fiscal year.
Yeah, I think the county, after the first year, changed some of the requirements for the program. I think we're in the third or fourth year of the program now, and I think that decreased the amount of money that they paid out as a part of the program.
I know one of the community concerns was you might help some people who don't need it, but why don't we just minimize the office expenses and just hit it at a taxable rate and help everybody in that demographic category or whatever tax value, so that it could be cost savings. But it would help me to know what is actually left and what the demand is before we look at that.
Yeah.
Number two, we always have a conversation about wage and compensation late in the game. So in my one-on-one, I asked to please have an analysis on the table of what it looks like to get our staff to living wage. I know that would require a future conversation. A big ticket item, 5 million, right, from our slides today, with multiple potentials to contract for change this year, which is what I understood on my one-on-one, is healthcare. We have multiple RFPs, requests for proposals out. With healthcare going up, there's a number of community members that have reached out to me with solutions to bring our costs down. And so I sent a packet of information to HR, and I understand there's potential for follow-up. I just wanted to make sure that conversation was in the room. Also, a thing that came up in my one-on-one is the idea that some cities and organizations are considering not covering certain prescriptions. And I felt cautious about that because healthcare decisions really should be made between health professionals and their patients. And I don't think we want to get into picking and choosing what the tools are that are available. But I am looking forward to hearing more from HR about the potential solutions, especially while we can make change. Regarding security at community centers, we talked about this a little bit. We're either backloading or front filling or whatever, but not every year is going to be an 18-month cost, right?
Yes, that's correct. So right now, what we have in the budget covers the rest of FY '26. So once we get to July, we'll have to we'll have to submit a contract change order for the rest of the year one of the contract, which will be like the next five or 6 months. I forget exactly when the turnover is. Then once we need to do year two of the contract, at that time, what we typically would do is encumber the entire amount of year two at a time. So that's why next year we kind of have that like half of a year plus a full year cost.
Or do we have to always budget for 18 months because we start the contract at the beginning of the year?
No, I guess it would be front loading, I guess.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we talked about. And then the last one is, this one's hard because I'm just elevating community concerns so we could be unsurprised when we hear it in the public comment. The idea that we have the fund balance as a rainy day fund. And yet we just had the rainiest day. Some folks are asking, why do we need to maintain the fund balance to our levels that we set right now? I know in the past, the conversation was to keep our bond rating so that we can borrow future bonds at a better rate. I also hear folks saying, but is now the right time to be planning for future debt? So I just think we need to be prepared as an organization to talk about fund balance, why it's important, especially through our recovery.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that and then maybe turn over to Tony with his long institutional knowledge to follow up. But I would say the thing about fund balance is that it's a pot of money, right? Like it's a pot of money that you can pull out of, and it doesn't necessarily like fully replenish. So what we're talking about is using that pot of money for ongoing costs that are happening every year. So I think that's kind of where the disconnect is, where we're using a one-time source of revenue to cover ongoing every year expenses. So as we go forward, we're digging a bigger hole for ourselves that we'll have to dig ourselves out in the future. So that's what I would say. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Tony.
That was a great answer. I'm just gonna go back to the slide here where we showed our fund balance trends, because I think that really tells the story, because I think, you know, what rating agencies and the LGC want to see is that a local government is maintaining its financial health. And if you, wherever you set your policy level at, whether it's 15%, 20%, or 25%, they want to see that you're maintaining that and staying around that amount. You don't want to see a fund balance that's always increasing every year. You also don't want to see a fund balance that's constantly decreasing as well. And I think that's the concern we see on our side right now, is that the last 3 years it has gone down and it is now below the policy target. And so I think that's what debt rating agencies, that's what the LGC is going to look at as we try to do future debt issuances. And they're going to ask the question of us, well, what are you all doing to shore up your budget to make sure every year you have enough revenue coming in to cover your expenses? I think, again, that's been the issue the last couple of years because of what Lindsay says. We have used some of the fund balance to cover our operating expenses. So.
Understood, thank you.
And I would just say thank you for asking that question, because I do think it's wonky and a little hard for the person on the street to understand. So it's important that we have those conversations.
I have a question to piggyback on maybe your second point, third point, sixth point. It was about living wage and getting that calculation earlier. If anyone can help me with this, how is the living wage calculated? In the past, I thought it was 3 times, I don't know, the average rental rate for the county. What happens if, in this instance where technically the rental rates are going down, does that mean we anticipate the living wage going down? And secondly, when will we have those numbers?
So we don't have them right now. My understanding, after you asked that question before, is Just Economics releases their estimate of the living wage in January historically. So we will be, refreshing their website for when it comes up. I think you're right. It is 3-year average of the rental.
Because it's kind of weird, even though the rental rates are going down, I feel like everything else is going up. But then if we're only using the rental rate, there might be some disparity that we don't normally see.
Yeah, and Lindsay's correct. So we have historically, as an organization, relied on the data from Just Economics as our barometer of what a living wage is. And they at least historically, they've updated that every January. We looked last week, the data that's out there now is still January 2025, so they haven't updated it with the most recent data. But you're right, it could go down because they use I think it's a 3 or 4 year average to determine what the actual living wage is for this year. And I think it's 30, they take that number and they multiply it by 0.33, which is the estimated amount that should go toward, households should be spending toward rent every year. But we will definitely get that updated number as soon as it's available. We can already do calculations based on last year's number to kind of see where we're at. And I think we've done that just about every year with council to kind of give you an idea of what the total cost would be if we wanted to lift all employees up to a living wage. And it's a fairly substantial dollar amount to do that. So
I'm just reading it from the website. It is a 4-year average of the fair market rent to mitigate any volatile changes going up and down. The calculation is available on Just Economics, WNC.org. It's based on the fair market rent as determined by HUD, and it's for the 4-county metro region.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Was there something else you wanted to follow up on? I'm trying to.
No.
Okay, or Tony, anything else for you?
I want to say one more thing.
Oh.
For
Is this
anybody,
for staff, or-
it's not for staff.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess, for anybody out there listening were watching, as I'm sure the press will share, we all had these meetings last week, and as the mayor mentioned, we've all had a little time to process. I know that this council is really concerned about affordability in our community and about our people, and that the idea of putting this all on the backs of every citizen, I can't imagine we're gonna do that. We know this would be so hard for our public to absorb, and so just as everyone out there is really struggling with groceries and cost of living and inflation, and it's hurting all of our wallets, we're seeing it reflected in the city budget as well, but that, I don't know how we're gonna fix this. I'm really gonna rely on my peers on this council for us to do hard work together to figure it out, but I just know that our community members are at our heart, and we know that this is hard out there, just like it's hard in the city budget, and we're gonna work as hard as we can to make sure that the impact on y'all is as little as possible.
Anyone else? Comments? All right. Okay, we don't have anything further on our agenda for this work session, but we do have a council meeting starting at 5 o'clock. So we'll take a break and come back at 5 o'clock.